We're at the Cross, the historic centre of Chester, where the roads that line the city's main streets converge. The roads are a feature of Chester's built heritage that really are unique, but they are a feature that it is easy to take for granted in their present form, without thinking how they emerged and how they have changed over the centuries. The buildings on the south side of the Cross are the subject of picture postcard views of the city, but they are only about 130 years old. Prior to that, this scene would have looked very different. Today, I want to look at why the roads were built where they are and what they tell us about the status and wealth of some of its citizens in the Middle Ages. I'll talk about how they represent an adaptation of a common type of medieval townhouse to Chester's topography, their fortunes over the centuries, and the massive 19th century rebuilding that did so much to shape the roads as we know them today. But this will only be scratching the surface of the subject. Each building has its own history, and there are many questions about the road system as a whole that we can't yet answer. So come with me on a multi-dimensional trip through Chester's history. We'll be going up, down, and literally all around the houses, and finding remains in sometimes intriguing relationships. The roads have been a focus of interest for the Chester Archaeological Society almost from its foundation in 1849. In volume 45 of our journal for 1958, Alderman Philip Lawson and J.T. Smith published a major review of road buildings, advanced differing theories on their origins, and called for further research. In 1984, the Society organised a conference on the subject, which led to the setting up of the Roads Research Project. Its results were published in a major report by English Heritage in 1999. The roads were built along the three main streets of the former Roman fortress, nowadays Bridge Street, Eastgate Street and Watergate Street. They also extend up the south end of Northgate Street, which is actually a post-Roman creation. To the south, they extended beyond the Roman fortress, down Lower Bridge Street as far as Duke Street. Along Eastgate Street, they seem never to have extended beyond St Werburgh Street on the north side, and it's uncertain if they went beyond Newgate Street on the south side. On Northgate Street, there is no sign that they went beyond what is now Town Hall Square, which originated as the eastern half of a huge Roman courtyard building. On Watergate Street, they stretched as far as Holy Trinity Church on one side and past Weaver Street on the other. Many sections of Row have vanished over the centuries, although if you look carefully you'll see signs of their former existence, but that is a subject I'll return to later. So what are the various elements of the buildings that we know as the rows? First, there is what it is convenient to call the street level. This consists of a sandstone cellar or undercroft, with its floor up to about 3 feet or 1 metre below present ground level, and with a stone vaulted ceiling or one of heavy beams supported on blocks, corbels, sometimes decorated, projecting from the walls. From front to back, in medieval times, the undercroft carried the row walkway, shops, sometimes service rooms, then an open hall rising to roof level, all typically timber framed. The hall might be set at right angles to the street over narrow undercroft, or parallel to the street over wider ones, or over a number of undercrofts. Above the shop and row walkway was the solar or street chamber. Sometimes there is yet another story above that. Rarely there is a courtyard behind, with a second building at its end. In front of the row walkway is the storeboard, normally sloping, over the area occupied by the steps down from the street into the undercroft. Access to the rows from the street is provided by steps every 3 properties or so. The back walls of the undercroft are buried below ground level, and at the sides of some properties, alleyways running back from the row walkway bring you out at the same level as the land at the rear. A final element of the row system that's now disappeared, but that was possibly important, was the cells. that are recorded on the west side of Bridge Street between Common Hall Street and Watergate Street. This is a term that has long puzzled historians, as the documents don't make it clear what they were, but they are now thought to have been long, narrow, open halls at row level with numerous stalls, like a bazaar. Where did the idea of the rows come from? The basic arrangement of shops, service rooms and a hall in line at right angles to the street with the solar above was a common one in the commercial areas of English medieval towns and allowed the most efficient use of narrow plots. Stone undercrofts are also often found, especially on sloping ground, as at Norwich, Haverfordwest and Shrewsbury, to create a level platform on which to build the rest of the house, and they permitted trading from two levels. Undercroft raised above street level, as found at Chester, requiring a gallery along the front to avoid the need for each shop to have its own steps, are much rarer. Examples often cited are 58 French Street, Southampton, and Tackler's Inn at Oxford. However, both of these buildings have been severely altered over the centuries, and the former existence of a gallery is disputed. What is unique about Chester is the construction of so many undercrofts side by side, which made possible their use to support a coherent system of raised walkways. About 180 survive to some extent at Chester, and there may originally have been over 250, compared, for example, with perhaps 88 at Norwich. Although at Chester undercroft and superstructure were originally built as parts of unitary structures, and sometimes have stairs linking them together, they often passed into separate occupation and ownership, which resulted in their having separate structural histories. From the beginning, parallels for the rows have been sought abroad, at Thun and Bern in Switzerland, with Padua and Bologna in Italy, and with the planned Bastide towns of Gascony in France, all of which have arcaded streets, and even with Constantinople and Venice, where there were two-tier colonnaded streets. There doesn't seem any need to invoke such exotic parallels as direct models for the rows. However, they would have been known to people connected with Chester at the time that the row system emerged, and may have encouraged experimentation with new urban forms. As an aside, true subterranean cellars are sometimes found at Chester. Two running westward from Northgate Street were exposed when the Northgate Brewery site was excavated in 1972. The modern extension to Canning Street lies on their site, and a well room attached to one of them has been preserved and re-erected at Ness Gardens. They are also occasionally found beneath undercrofts. That is how you can peer into the hypercaust of the Roman baths at number 39 Bridge Street, and the digging of a new cellar at the end of the 19th century exposed the fallen Roman columns and column bases that until recently were exposed under Pret-a-Manger at 23 Northgate Street. The rows have long been generally accepted as having originated in the 13th to 14th centuries. There were three events that could have been important in their development. First, a fire on the 15th of May 1278, which the Annales Castrienses, the Annals of Chester, record as having burnt down almost the entire city within the walls. In his article in our journal for 1958, J.T. Smith argued that this would have provided the opportunity for a planned reconstruction, incorporating row walkways and stone party walls to stop the spread of any future fires. However, the extent of the fire can be doubted. No archaeological evidence has ever been found. The annals may have exaggerated its extent, and although there are plenty of stone undercrofts, there is a shortage of known stone party walls at higher levels. Moreover, there is dendrochronological evidence from Booth Mansion and 12 Watergate Street that strongly suggest that these buildings were constructed before the fire. Secondly, at the end of the 13th century, Chester's status changed from that of a modest provincial city to a strategic military base of national importance, serving Edward I's campaigns in Wales and his subsequent programme of castle building. In 1282-3, this drew well over 1,000 craftsmen and labourers to Chester from across England. from as far afield as Northumberland, Kent and Hampshire, and many of them would have spent the winter months in the city, where they would have been available for work. Carpenters, diggers, masons and woodcutters are all recorded. Thirdly, throughout the 13th century, political power in Chester was passing from the earls' appointed officials such as the sheriff to the mayor as the representative of the city's merchant class. A charter of Edward I in 1300 confirmed a wide range of rights to citizens. Several merchant families came to the fore. The Hurrell and Brickhill families dealt in prestige commodities like wine and wool, but the most prominent was William of Doncaster, King's merchant, who imported vast quantities of wine from Gascony, grain from Ireland, supplied the Welsh castles and rented lead mines in Flintshire. In Chester, he bought up many properties along the main trading streets. It's in this commercial boom that we should probably look for the origins of the rose. Overall, the rose are thought to have developed over the period 1250 or a little earlier to about 1350. The documentary evidence links the earliest sections of the rose with the cells on the west side of Bridge Street and the properties around St Peter's Church at the Cross, both areas where the civic authorities are likely to have been influential. It's possible that the idea of the rose came from royal interest in the city and was sustained by the civic authorities until the advantages of a joined-up system of walkways became recognised. There were already substantial stone buildings with undercrofts in Chester by the late 12th century. The house of Peter the Clerk, the Earl's Chancellor, is recorded in 1208 as lying on the corner of Castle Street and Lower Bridge Street. It's likely that the sandstone walls of the cellar of the Old King's Head belonged to this building. Richard the Engineer, Edward I's master mason, who worked on many of the King's Welsh castles, had a house almost opposite, later known as Paris or Parias Hall, next to St Olave's Church. Its ruins are shown on a drawing of the church by Randall Home, dated to 1690, and medieval stonework was seen when Quick's garage was built in the 1960s. The building shown next to the church on this 19th century print probably occupies its site. In the medieval period, rows of shops grouped together on a particular street and devoted to a single trade were common. The same was true at Chester, except here the documentary evidence makes it clear that these rows were raised above undercrofts. The ones that are known are as follows: Watergate Street North, Fleshmongers Row as far as Gough Street; Watergate Street South, the Fishboards; Bridge Street West, the Stone Celled and the Shoemakers' Cells or Corvises Row; Bridge Street East, Mercer's Row; Eastgate Street North, the Butter Shops with a dark row behind, Baker's Row and Glover's Row; Eastgate Street South, Cornmarket Row; Northgate Street West, Ironmongers Row, later Shoemakers Row. I've already mentioned that undercrofts were a device used elsewhere to provide a level building platform on sloping sites. By definition, one side of these undercrofts would have been wholly or partly buried, and the other wholly or partly exposed. What was the reason for their use in Chester? The current theory is that the medieval builders were faced with two main constraints: the high level of the sandstone bedrock, which discouraged them from digging conventional cellars, and the so-called Roman debris slope rising from the streets, which would have blocked rear access to ground-based superstructures and induced rot in the timbers. An influential image supporting the latter idea has been a drawing by the former city archaeologist Tim Strickland of the ruins of a Roman building at el Jamal in northern Jordan. In broad terms, both of these factors seem valid, but I think that the reality was a bit more complicated. First of all, as we have seen, there are true subterranean cellars in the centre of Chester, although they tend to be later than the undercrofts. Secondly, I think we need to get away from imagining that the fortress area of Chester in the 13th century was like the bombed-out ruins of a European city in 1945, full of mounds of loose debris from multi-storey buildings. I find that trying to work out what was going on a fascinating subject, so I'm going to take a little time to explore it. There had certainly been some very substantial Roman buildings in the parts of Chester where the rows developed. The headquarters building stretching between Havilton Place and the Cross, the commander's residence alongside it between Northgate Street and St Werburgh Street, the baths on the east side of Bridge Street, and one or more courtyard buildings on the west side of Bridge Street, possibly including the hospital. However, much of what are now Watergate Street and Eastgate Street, and the top end of Bridge Street, would have been lined with much less substantial barracks, tribunes' houses and the like, and perhaps even open-fronted storerooms. In addition, the southwestern part of the baths was merely a walled exercise yard, with the more substantial vaulted heated rooms lying on the east side of the site. Elsewhere, minor medieval streets were laid out across barrack areas. Newgate Street, St Werburgh Street, Pincer Street and King Street, without paying any heed to the Roman buildings. Along what was to become Lower Bridge Street, Roman occupation was very thin. We must also remember that when construction of the roads started about the middle of the 13th century, it was 350 years since intensive reoccupation of Chester had begun under Ethelfled, and well over 100 years since the construction of the Norman castle, extended city walls and parish churches. It's reasonable to imagine that most of the loose debris from Roman buildings would long since have been cleared away, and that many standing structures would have been dismantled so that their materials could be reused, leaving only their lowest courses. Indeed, we know that in some cases even the foundations were robbed out. Here is a reconstruction of what Chester may have looked like in the 10th century. I think we underestimate the influence of topography on the evolution of the rows. The landscape as the Romans found it, how they responded to it, and as they left it for later ages. We're all aware of the gradients on Lower Bridge Street and Lower Watergate Street, but there are other gentler gradients that we easily overlook as we walk around Chester, for instance between Town Hall Square and the Cross. This map of the level of the bedrock underlying Chester, as recorded up to 1976, suggests that the Romans had to cope with a site with pronounced slopes, from north to south and from a central ridge down to the east and west, although the latest data suggest that the slope down to the southeast may not have been as great as suggested here. Further to the south, a natural gully ran down to the Dee. I should like to suggest that over time the major Roman buildings came to occupy platforms or terraces at different levels. As archaeologists, we think a lot about the horizontal plan of Roman Chester, but pay little attention to what it was like in the vertical dimension. There is little published information, so these ideas have to be tentative. We know that the courtyard of the headquarters building was raised in the 3rd century, so that at its southern end it is now about 1 metre above pavement level at the top of Watergate Street, at about 26 metres above Ordnance Datum. The raised entrance to St Peter's Church and its churchyard are perhaps a reminiscence of this. By contrast, the hypocaust of the Tribune's house, found south of Watergate's wine bar and opposite the southwest corner of the headquarters building, lay at about 25 metres above Ordnance Datum, that is, about a metre below the courtyard of the headquarters. A column of the next building to the west lay at 23.8 metres, just over 1 metre lower. The foundations of the granaries further to the west lay at 21 metres. This series of heights suggests a number of terraces or platforms to counter the natural slope. As an aside, the row building in front of the granaries at 63-5 Watergate Street, known to older residents as the Gap, was the scene of a gunpowder explosion on the 5th of November 1772, which killed 40 people watching a puppet show on the floor below. There is also some evidence for this stepping on the west side of Bridge Street. The courtyard of the Roman building that extended south of Common Hall Street, marked in red on this section of number 36 Bridge Street, seems to have lain at a height of about 24 metres. However, the building to the south, behind the three old arches, seems to have lain at about 22.5 metres, again marked in red, the same level as the baths on the other side of Bridge Street. We're reliant on Lawson's drawings in volume 45 of our journal for much of this information. They are a model of cross-period thinking. Nevertheless, it would be good to have more up-to-date information to corroborate the picture. A confusing feature of Chester's landscape that has been mentioned in connection with the rows is that the fact that the floors of the Roman buildings that we have just mentioned are higher than the present street level. This begs the question of what were the Roman street levels. The remains of a Roman drain found in 2000 near the top of Watergate Street had its top courses missing. This suggests that the Roman street could have been level with the hypocaust floor found nearby behind Watergate's wine bar, about 60 centimetres above the present street level, which has apparently been subject to down cutting. Truncated Roman remains have also been found in front of St Michael's Church, again suggesting down cutting of that part of Bridge Street. However, the 3rd century courtyard of the building that extended south of Common Hall Street is reported to have been about 1 metre above the Roman street level, apparently the result of repeated rebuilding. The courtyard of the headquarters building also seems likely to have lain above the ancient as well as the modern street level. For the area around the Eastgate, our information on ground levels is poor. An excavation in 1972 that revealed part of the medieval gateway suggested that the roadway was about 10 feet or 3 metres below the modern level. The drawing of the Roman gate, made in 1766 when it was taken down, also makes it clear that much of it was buried, but exactly what the Roman level was remains uncertain. How did the medieval builders deal with this landscape? The natural fall of the land from north to south, perhaps sharpened in some places by Roman terraces and foundations, would have encouraged the use of undercrofts. We can see what happened at 12 Watergate Street, near the southwestern corner of the Roman headquarters building, a site that was thoroughly investigated before redevelopment in 1985. There, the remains of the Roman building had been removed to permit the construction of the undercroft, and the bedrock excavated to a depth of about 1 metre. To the rear of the undercroft, the Roman remains survived, albeit below the top of the undercroft, and a wall marked in green on the section drawing was built on top of them to support the timber superstructure of the medieval building that extended beyond the undercroft. On the west side of Northgate Street, undercrofts were also dug into the side of the Roman headquarters building, and these survived until the end of the 19th century. But as the ground level rose to what is now Town Hall Square, these seem to have ceased, to be replaced by true subterranean cellars. 23 Northgate Street, Pret-a-Manger, is and was a conventional building without an undercroft, with its ground floor just above street level, directly overlying the Roman remains. On the east side of the street, true rows probably didn't extend past St Nicholas Chapel, more recently the Music Hall, beyond which lay the precinct of St Werburgh's Abbey. However, Hodgson's painting of 1831 suggests an undercroft north of the chapel, almost at the junction with Town Hall Square. Is the possible difference between the two sides of the street the result of slightly different ground levels? And did the level courtyard and floors of the Roman headquarters building serve as a sort of datum for the medieval buildings on the west side of the street? On the east side of Bridge Street, where the floors of hypocaust of the Roman baths lay at present street level, they were sometimes partly removed by the medieval undercrofts, but some later extension to these weren't as deep and reused these floors. We noted earlier that there is no evidence for rows on the north side of Eastgate Street, east of St Werburgh Street, and we're not certain if they existed on the south side, east of Newgate Street. This may be something to do with the ground levels having apparently been very low there in medieval times, which would account for the great present-day depth of Brown's Crypt a little to the west, which seems to have been built for a very much lower road level. We really don't know what was going on there. In conclusion, the topography in the form of the high level of the bedrock and the north-south slope seems to have been the major factor in the adoption of undercroft and the development of the row system. Roman remains certainly played a part, but it seems to have been in the form of building platforms and foundations rather than mounds of loose debris. These remains lay below the top of the undercroft. The cloverleaf pattern of raised ground in the backlands behind the four main streets of the city that you can see in the contour lines of the map is the result of the construction of the row undercroft and their confining effect on the soil deposits that built up in the medieval period, not a reason for the construction of the undercroft. So what of Lower Bridge Street, where, as I have said, Roman occupation was much thinner? Here, the incentive to build undercroft was provided by the fact that the street followed the deepening gully down to the river. However, regardless of the topography, the elevated row walkways could not have developed without numerous undercroft side by side, and, as we have seen, their construction was probably the result of commercial factors. I've already mentioned the basic elements of row buildings. However, these were not static but have changed over the centuries. Obviously, each building will have been slightly different, but the suggested restoration of 12 Watergate Street can serve as an example. In the later 13th century, it consisted of a stone undercroft, a timber hall or possibly shop above, fronting onto the row walkway, and further rooms behind. Note that at this time there was no stallboard. There are grounds for arguing that in fact this was preceded by a building that was in stone up to and including row level. The same phenomenon, 2 stories of stonework and lack of stallboard, can be seen today at the 3 old arches on Bridge Street, while a stone arch over the row survives at Booth Mansion on Watergate Street. The later 14th and 15th centuries were a time of economic decline in Chester. The rows were now an accepted part of the city's landscape, and trade continued in them, but some shops were reported empty, including possibly the 3 old arches, and others were in danger of collapse. However, there was some rebuilding, especially of the splendid open hall at Leach House on the south side of Watergate Street and at the Old King's Head. We'll talk about Leach House a bit more later. In the later 16th and the first half of the 17th centuries, Chester shared in the general rise in wealth in England, and this was reflected in the rebuilding of the town houses and shops of the merchant class, particularly those in the rows, which remained the commercial heart of the city. This was more than a cosmetic resurfacing. 1/3 of recorded superstructures date from this time, usually above earlier undercrofts. Sometimes this ambitious rebuilding caused members of the city elite financial problems. Typical changes were the subdivision of rooms, the insertion of brick chimney stacks to replace open hearths, elaborate panelling and other decorative woodwork, and especially the enlargement of the street chamber over the row. This was often higher than before and jetted out over the street, supported on posts. Later, the space between these posts was enclosed, producing the stallboards. Already in the 13th and 14th centuries, we hear in the document of porcheria, porches, presumably light wooden structures in front of the stone undercrofts. In premises where the structure is visible, you can sometimes see that the stallboards are supported on brick walls, while the original undercroft is of stone. The conjectural reconstruction of 12 Watergate Street shows this rebuilding, with the street chamber supported on posts and a stallboard. Splendid examples of fireplaces of the period can be seen in the Diva Hotel, Gamel House Brewery Tap and Leach House when, fingers crossed, it reopens to trade. Bishop Lloyd's Palace, now occupied by the Chester Civic Trust, shows a wide variety of decoration of the period. Another good example of the Great Rebuilding can be seen at 38 to 42 Watergate Street. There, the weak modern frontage hides a well-preserved house of the early 14th century across 3 plots, occupied by Katie's tea rooms. Unlike most buildings, it was of stone at row level. In the late 16th century, the large open hall parallel to the street had an extra floor inserted, and back-to-back fireplaces were built to create 4 heated rooms. You can see how the chamber above the row has been extended forwards and is now supported on posts rising from the street. By the middle of the 17th century, commercial pressure led to the erection of shops on the storeboards, impeding light and access to the existing row shops. The tensions between public and private interests inherent in the row system became acute, and increasingly wealthy people sought to incorporate the row walkway into their houses. The first recorded enclosure was by Sir Richard Grosvenor in 1643 at 6 Lower Bridge Street, now the Falcon, where the enclosed row now forms part of the bar. In 1676, Lady Mary Calverley was allowed to rebuild her house at 18 to 24 Lower Bridge Street in Baroque style. It still had its main rooms at first floor level, but the row was completely gone. Between about 1640 and 1740, nearly 1/3 of the system of the raised walkways disappeared. In general, enclosures were most common at the end of streets furthest from the cross, perhaps reflecting their lower commercial value. The greatest losses were on Lower Bridge Street, which had always had the grandest houses, although isolated fragments survive today. There was less enclosure on Eastgate Street and Northgate Street, which were more commercially active. In Watergate Street in 1700, George Booth of Dunham Massey remodelled 2 medieval buildings to produce the impressive Baroque mansion that now bears his name. However, in contrast to Lady Mary Calverley's house in Lower Bridge Street, here the row walkway and shops survived. I mentioned previously the enclosure of the storeboards. You can see an example of this in the left-hand image by an unknown artist of the south side of Eastgate Street in the early 19th century. There are booths to the left and right, with a short section of open storeboard in the middle and a length of row walkway disappearing behind the left-hand booth. The right-hand image is of the east side of Lower Bridge Street, again in the early 19th century. You can see that only a short length of row walkway survives. Note that in both pictures, although the undercroft and booths above them have been extended in front of the line of the walkway, there has been no extension of the upper stories that we noted as a feature of the Great Rebuilding. We mustn't impose false ideas of uniformity on our visions of the rows in the past. By the middle of the 19th century, there was a renewal of interest in the rows amongst visitors to Chester. The Chester Archaeological Society called for the preservation of historic buildings in the city and for the revival of traditional architecture against the then fashionable neoclassical style. This change in taste is exemplified by 3 adjoining buildings in Eastgate Street. The Greek Revival building erected in 1828 as the first part of Brown's department store, the adjoining Gothic Revival building of 1858 to the right by Thomas Mannering Penson, which sits above one of the most impressive medieval undercrofts, and Penson's first substantial attempt at the vernacular revival at numbers 36 to 8 Eastgate Street, immediately to the left of the 1828 building, again for the Brown family. Another early champion of the vernacular revival was James Harrison, the first architectural correspondent of the Archaeological Society. He was responsible for the restoration of God's Providence House in Watergate Street in 1862. This is the first recorded example of conservation in the city. A new owner wanted to demolish the existing building, but as architect, Harrison deferred to public opinion and claimed to have preserved its ancient character, although the new building was much larger than the old. Other notable proponents of the vernacular revival were John Douglas and Thomas Meakin Lockwood, both of whom worked for the Duke of Westminster. It was Lockwood who was responsible for the buildings on the corners of Bridge Street at the Cross, erected in 1888 and 1892. Although he had antiquarian interest, in rebuilding he seems to have preferred a clean sweep and to remove earlier structures. However, one restoration project he did undertake was Bishop Lloyd's Palace for Giles Brown, but even there the steps from the street are his introduction. A major scheme right at the end of the 19th century, in which Douglas played a major part, was the rebuilding in its present form of Shoemaker's Row, on the west side of Northgate Street. This led to the disappearance of an elevated row walkway, although some of the undercroft walls survive beneath the modern buildings. Finally, we should note St Michael's Row by W.T. and P.H. Lockwood. This wasn't a true row, but a typical Edwardian shopping arcade. As first built, it was faced in white tiles, but these were replaced by half timbering by public demand in 1911. It's noteworthy that in contrast to the enclosures of the 18th century, walkways were included in these new developments, a reflection of the fact that they were now recognised as a major element of the city's appeal. During the 1960s, the conservation movement got off the ground, led in Chester by the Civic Trust. A number of new row buildings have been erected, although some of those from the 1960s are perhaps now showing their age, but that is a story for others to tell. I want to go off on a tangent now and explore some interesting buildings surviving and demolished that didn't fit neatly into my main story. The first is a record of a medieval building demolished in 1892 between Northgate Street and St Werburgh Street. It's noteworthy in a number of ways. It formed the rear range of a courtyard building, rare in Chester, of which the front range, incorporating a row, stood on the site of what is now Rose's nightclub. The rear range, like the front, had an undercroft, which would have had its floor roughly level with an adjacent Roman hypocaust that was part of the commander's residence. Another small courtyard lies behind Leach House on the south side of Watergate Street. In the early 17th century, a gallery carried on wooden columns was built around the side of the courtyard. At the back of the courtyard there may have been a kitchen and dining room, on the site of the now apparently isolated 18th century Lion House. You can see both the courtyard and Lion House from the service road behind Watergate Street. West of Cook Street, on the north side of Watergate Street, the rows have gone, but the steps up to the front doors at first floor level are a reminder of their former existence. Further down, there is a recessed terrace of 5 gabled buildings, and again these have steps to floors above undercrofts. These buildings were erected in 1852 on the site of the 17th century mansion belonging at one time to the Mannering family. If you look at the right-hand image, you can see that there is a residual row in the middle of the building, on each side of a porch over steps, but at each end the row has been enclosed. The undercroft have been extended forward of the row walkway. Down Lower Bridge Street, as I mentioned earlier, the rows have disappeared, apart from in a few isolated buildings on the east side. However, there is a 19th century painting by Louise Rayner which shows how Tudor House once had a row with a bridge carrying the walkway over the entry to the next building to the south. Finally, I want to talk about the steeply sloping section of Lower Bridge Street between St Olaf's Church and Duke Street, now the site of Quick's Garage, where there is now no trace of rows. Some of the buildings here fronted onto a solid raised footway, while others were true rows with a covered gallery above an undercroft entered from the street. The superstructures were partly built on terraces cut into the sloping rock face, as were also the undercrofts. The building on the corner of Duke Street shows a 16th century stone arcade carrying a brick superstructure that may originally have been in timber. This building was demolished in 1829, and by 1850 the walkway had been lowered as seen in this photo taken at the start of demolition in the early 1960s, although again the steps to the raised doorways can be seen. Throughout the centuries, the rows have swung between being practical and fashionable to being regarded as a nuisance and disreputable. There is no pristine row. All the buildings have been modified over the centuries, but they embody fragments that reflect different periods of the city's history, and their existence is a major part of its distinctiveness. Please take your time to go and explore them. You can access all but the most recent volumes of our journal and Andrew Brown's report on the Rose Research Project free online via the Archaeology Data Service website. Just type Journal of the Chester Archaeological Society or Brown, Rose of Chester into your web browser. Simon Ward's report on his 1985 investigation of 12 Watergate Street is available from the Grosvenor Museum. There is a short film on Bishop Lloyd's Palace on the Chester Heritage Festival website, which you can watch here. If you would like to join the Society or would like to get in touch with us, please follow the links below.